Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on wherever you are. My name is Prema George. I am the Certification Director at e-Stewards. Thank you for joining today's webinar on Once and for All, 2 ways to finally halt the export of American e-waste to developing countries. Today's webinar has 2 of the e-Stewards prominent recyclers, starting with Bob Houghton, who's the CEO of Sage Sustainable Electronics, who will address why halt the export of e-waste to developing countries, followed by Neil Peters-Misha, CEO of Cascade Asset Management, who will talk about the Secure E-Waste Export and Recycling Act, SEERA. They are both steering committee members for the Coalition for American Electronics Recyclers, CERA. Finally, to focus on the ratification of the Basel Convention by the United States, we have Jim Puckett, Director of the Basel Action Network. He has been part of the Basel Action Network from the beginning of the convention itself. So at the end of this webinar, we will take questions from you. We do hope you find the session useful. This webinar is recorded and we will post it on our website for you to be able to see later. Now over to Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Prema. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the Coalition for American Electronics Recycling. CAER, as it's known on Capitol Hill, is an organization founded at the grassroots to address problems created for both our industry and our country by the lack of reasonable e-waste regulations at the federal level. The coalition includes some of the largest, in fact, the largest ITAD and recycling companies in the world. And it's also made up of many small and medium-sized independent companies across the United States. Our membership includes over 130 companies operating more than 300 facilities in 37 states, Puerto Rico, and the District of Columbia. The United States is the only developed country without national regulations governing the export of electronic waste. And this is a regulatory vacuum that's existed for many years that has retarded the development of our industry, speaking specifically about the electronic recycling industry. It's created a number of national security risks that we'll talk about, and it's made our industry party to the informal recycling practices that exist in developing countries worldwide that are damaging both to the environment and to worker safety and health. And this last point is a moral problem, of course, because of the human cost. But the continued unregulated trade in e-waste, we believe, also creates a credibility problem with the very enterprise customers that are the backbone of the electronics recycling industry. And so as a result, electronics recyclers do have a deserved reputation problem. To speak specifically about the problems created by the lack of reasonable regulation on the national security level, which has had a great deal of interest recently in our conversations on Capitol Hill, when scrap electronics are exported to developing countries for recycling, very often they are literally unprocessed, and this includes the data-bearing devices, which in many cases, it's been well documented, still include the confidential data of individuals and companies. And consequently, there's a very well-developed black market in data trading, which exists when those data-bearing devices are harvested and the confidential records contained in them are sold. So one of the problems of exporting is directly for citizens and companies alike in the United States, privacy breaches, identity theft, and even the loss of company intellectual property. A second problem resulting in a national security risk is the counterfeiting of IC chips that takes place using the scrap electronics exported from the United States and other developing developed countries, which the scrap serves as feedstock for counterfeiters that harvest the chips, reskin them, relabel them, and then sell them as new chips back into our industrial and military supply chains. And it's been well documented by CAER subject matter experts that these chips lead to failures and unreliability in critical systems, and so literally putting lives and infrastructure at risk from the lack of high-grade quality control that is an expectation anytime you're buying new electronics. The domestic recycling industry itself has been facing unfair competition, essentially, from exporters. When you compare the infrastructure investment that's necessary to create an ITAD business that is a responsible electronics disposition business, we may be talking about millions of dollars per facility. If we're talking about a resource recovery recycler, we could be talking about many millions of dollars a facility. All of those responsible businesses are forced to compete with exporters that claim to be recyclers to the industry, but which in fact are basically operating loading docks where electronics are shoved into shipping containers and shipped to developing countries. And so the race to the bottom that this creates encourages the industry to take shortcuts or encourages outright irresponsible practices. And perhaps most importantly, in terms of the development of a more sustainable future, it inhibits investment in new technologies and new infrastructure. So one of the indirect results of externalizing these costs of responsible recycling, as we have done for many years in the United States, is the lack of great new technologies that will make us more sustainable, that will make electronics a source of more than just a few commodity materials, and in fact, fully recyclable. On the environmental health and safety level, the Basel Action Network has done a stellar job of documenting the recycling activities in informal operations around the world in developing countries. These were first made prominent in, or notorious perhaps, in China. But since China has been clamping down on some of these operations domestically in China, we see the informal recycling industry spreading worldwide in low-wage countries. The Basel Action Network has also documented well that companies in the United States claiming to be responsible recyclers are literally responsible for defrauding their customers by exporting instead. All of this contributes to environmental and worker health damage worldwide, and ultimately holds our industry back, and the entire marketplace is doubtful of the ethics of our industry because of the actions of a few. So the coalition has worked with industry stakeholders and over a number of years worked with a bipartisan group of lawmakers to define the Secure Electronics Export and Recycling Act, or SEERA. And in general, SIRA benefits job creation and growth of the business, increased exports, not a restriction of exports, and improved security. So I'll talk about these points individually. The job creation that would result from onshoring much of the recycling activity that has been outsourced to low-wage countries has been estimated by an economist hired by the coalition to do a study on this, the impact of the bill. It's been estimated that this would create 42,000 or more new recycling jobs in the United States and in excess of $1 billion in annual payroll. So when we talk to lawmakers on Capitol Hill, jobs creation is always a benefit. On a business and industry development perspective, onshoring this activity and ensuring that electronic waste is recycled properly before the export of commodities and refurbished equipment. This would increase the volumes that our industry is asked to manage and also increase the business case for infrastructure investment across the industry. We do feel that the industry has more than adequate capacity at this point to handle the increased volumes initially, but as the volume of electronics is increasing in the marketplace, it is doubtless that additional investments in infrastructure would be necessary. So business growth and a maturity of the industry is one of the direct impacts of having responsible regulation in place. One of the things that we frequently talk about in our discussions on Capitol Hill is the question of trade versus trade restriction. And in fact, our proposed bill does restrict trade in e-waste, defined as unprocessed electronics, but it will foster the development and expansion of high-value exports, first in terms of finished grade commodities. So instead of exporting scrap to informal recycling operations for the benefit of a few pennies per pound, domestic recycling will produce finished grade commodities that will have a ready market on the world commodities market, and export value will go up as a result of converting the scrap or the e-waste, if you will, to finished grade commodities. It's also true that the sale of working tested electronics will increase. There is a subset of the export trade today, which is essentially the export of barely functional or completely obsolete electronics for quote unquote repair overseas. If that material were tested and refurbished in the United States, again, comparable to the example of finished commodities, we would be increasing the overall value add in the domestic marketplace for export to a willing worldwide market for refurbished electronics. And that's particularly relevant in the current context, which following the pandemic's restriction of supply chains has a premium on high quality refurbished electronics worldwide. And then finally, by requiring that electronics be processed before export, the data security and counterfeiting issues will be addressed by the bill. So eliminating the trade in data-bearing devices that are unsanitized and harvested from electronic scrap will protect the privacy and the intellectual property of our citizens and our companies, and choke off the supply of chips that are used in counterfeiting. And so it's an easy proposition in many respects to get support for on Capitol Hill, because depending on what side of the aisle a member may be sitting on, we're either talking about job creation and business growth, export growth, improved security, or improved worker health and environmental safety. So many benefits come from sensible regulation, and the coalition has worked now for a number of years to grow the support for a sensible bill that will help our industry continue to mature. And one aspect of this, which we'll be talking about momentarily, is we also support, as a coalition, ratification of the Basel Convention, and this is directly in support of the export trade. The current scenario where the United States is not a party or has not ratified the convention creates problems for large commodity recyclers in the US. And so we see ratification of the Basel Convention as well as national level e-waste regulations as facilitating business while it improves security and environmental compliance. So with that, I'll turn the mic over to Neil for a discussion of the specifics of SIRA. Neil?
I'll get unmuted here. Thank you very much, Bob. Appreciate the introduction and giving a lot of context into why this legislation is important. I'm going to focus more on what the legislation is and exactly how it would work. Coming from a recycler processor perspective, I hope that can help people. A little bit of background on SIRA. It wasn't originally SIRA. There was similar legislation that was introduced in 2010 called the Responsible Electronics Recycling Act, or RERA, so people may remember that. That actually came mostly from environmental organizations that were looking at amending solid waste laws and having the EPA run a program that would essentially implement a lot of the protections that are in the Basel Convention and restricting the export of certain types of electronic waste. There was a business group that came together, and Bob Houghton actually helped kick this off to say, you know, businesses care about this too. It's not just an environmental issue. And so CAER was formed soon after to show our support for the legislation. We realized that some of the implementation of that legislation was difficult, especially since half the people in Congress wanted to eliminate the EPA. And so having the EPA start up a new program didn't make sense. And also just the implementation of export laws and how to manage it didn't make sense to run in a mostly domestic agency. So when we worked a lot with different stakeholders, we realized that the Commerce Department and the ones that regulate the export of materials would be a better place to house this legislation. And that's why it was changed to the name of SEERA and really focusing on exports and looking at security aspects with exports. So it's been in a few different Congresses, it's been introduced, and it was just reintroduced this year as HR 3036 by Representatives Espaillat and Stivers. So it was just in a couple of weeks ago. It's going to be managed in the Committee on Foreign Affairs, so that makes sense to take a look at exports. And we expect a companion bill to be introduced soon in the Senate. And for many years, we've had Senator Whitehouse be the sponsor of it. And so we're looking to, again, bring bipartisan support for these bills. So this is very recent news. So let's take a look at what's in SEERA. There are two main terms being defined, and they're defined maybe a little bit differently than people are used to in our industries. Electronic waste is a fairly comprehensive term. It's really looking at any used computers, consumer electronics, data center equipment, mobile phones. There's an actual specific list that's in the bill that talks about what's included. And notably, it also includes components of electronics. So as people are starting to take apart or disassemble electronics, that would cover circuit boards, motors, plastics, things like that, that are derived from the used computer equipment. Then there are a number of exemptions related to the Act. So kind of everything's thrown in as electronic waste, and then we pull certain things out of it. the legislation isn't going to be able to regulate everything, and there's some things that are just kind of outside the scope of this industry that we did not want to include. So of course, electronics are now showing up more and more in motor vehicles and appliances. That's outside the scope of this legislation. If a business, say Microsoft, wants to ship out 10 pallets of their computers to their operations in Spain, they can do that as long as they still own it. So that's not under the scope of this legislation, so not managing those exports to the same entity. And if a person wants to send their cousin in Thailand a few computers, that's not counted as well. So we're really focusing on normal exports of used electronics. So in order to export those electronics, it has to be one of three things. It has to either be tested and working. It has to be what's defined as low risk counterfeit electronics, and that's essentially scrap material, which I'll define more later, and recalled electronics. So generally speaking, the law says, or the bill says, except as provided in this legislation, no person or entity may export or re-export electronic waste or exempted electronic waste items unless certain conditions are satisfied. So this isn't just applying to developing countries or exporting to developing countries. It is to any country, and it's to not distinguish between one or another country or play them against one another. And it's also realizing the situation that people might ship something to Canada and then it gets re-exported into developing countries. And so it's not really preventing the ultimate disposal of the waste in a way that we don't want to encourage. So then you have to look at who can export. A key piece of this legislation is in order to export, you need to be registered on a site that's managed by the Secretary of Commerce. So it's like an EPA ID registration. It's not a license, it's not a permit, but it is a registration. And part of it is to be able to understand and get some transparency of who is exporting materials. So that's a key thing. You have to be registered before you can export any of these used electronics. So what can be exported? Well, we go back to those exemptions. So in a little bit more detail, the tested working used electronics need to be determined as fully functional. So for those people who have an e-Stewards or an R2 certification, who have to deal with full functionality and testing, that's already what we're doing. And it's expected that the Secretary of Commerce would be implementing rules and programs around determining full functionality based on those standards. But we only want to ship, as Bob said, functioning equipment and not items that are shipped for repair. The people that are purchasing and receiving the electronics need to intend to reuse those products. They're not just buying them on the cheap to harvest the parts and throw away the hazardous materials that they don't want to handle. So it's intended to be reused, and the items have to be packaged properly to maintain their integrity. The next big group of things is the scrap materials. So it's really like the circuit boards, it's plastic pellets, it's motors, things like that. First of all, to deal with that security issue, they have to go to a place that's going to destroy them and not reuse the processors or chips. So we want to deal with that counterfeit issue, and that's a requirement that it needs to go to a facility that is capable of destroying them, generally through recycling, smelting, that kind of process. And what is exported needs to be seen or used as a direct feedstock into a reclamation process with no additional hand or mechanical separation required. So you can't be sending something like one example would be a bale of plastic that someone else has to hand sort, maybe use a flame to sniff and smell the different plastic chemistries and separate them while creating a real hazard, and then it gets shredded and separated. That would not be allowed. You can send out clean streams of materials that can go directly into a shredder or a smelter where those better programs may exist overseas. The other caveat too is if we're shipping something to another country, the importing country's laws about what they can receive have to be followed, and we need to get a sign off on that. The last exemption is for recalled electronics, and this has always been a challenge where manufacturers have stepped up, and they've said that, you know, a lot of times their products are manufactured overseas. It might need a product safety recall or a warranty return, and so the only place that we've got contract manufacturers are overseas. We recognize that that is a legitimate business claim, so that has been allowed in there with some caveats. The only reason that it can be exported and re-exported is if it's going to a manufacturer or its agent to repair it. If it's just being shipped back over to, say, Thailand for scrap disposal because they can't reuse it, that would not be allowed. So we do want to still make sure that there isn't this kind of leak of electronics being exported that are not being properly processed overseas. So how do you export? Well, we're going to use existing tools that are already made available that people are used to in the export system, which is the automated export system, computer system that brokers and exporters can log into, and they would be the people who are the exporters of record who would be able to log into the system. They need to describe the type and quantity of whatever they're shipping in that lot, the names of the countries that are going to receive the items, who the ultimate consignee is that's going to receive the items. So if it's the scrap materials, to name the processor. If it's the buyer of the tested working equipment, the name of that buyer. And then declaring that the consignee has those permits, resources, and competence to manage this. This gives a lot of transparency and it logs what's happening. So in addition to logging this electronically in the AES, you need to provide some documentation along with the shipment, which is the exporter registration. So it shows that you're on that list that Commerce is maintaining. You'll repeat a lot of things that are put in the automated export system, such as what's in the load. And if you're sending out tested working electronics, you need to describe what the test methods were to be able to demonstrate that they are tested working electronics. And then if it is low risk counterfeit electronic scrap, you have to make sure that if there is a consent requirement from the importing country, that that is received. And an officer of the company that's doing the exporting needs to declare everything is up to snuff. How this is going to be managed is, again, using this export administration program to track and manage those exports. Again, familiar to brokers and exporters. The exporter of record is going to be the one responsible for doing the registration. But I know like for Cascade and many other companies, we may work with a broker. And in those cases, we are the US principal party of interest that generates the material. And we're going to have to provide the test information and the test records that the broker would need to use as the exporter of record to fill into the system. Again, this provides transparency. Right now, there is no harmonized tariff code that looks at used electronics. One of the things that we don't have in our system is just a sense on the scope of how much electronics are being exported. There are some codes that are used for shredded boards and ferrous waste, but it doesn't really have a way to track what's being exported. And so we're using some of these studies and making conjecture on how much electronics is being exported, but without actually having this tariff code, which this system is going to introduce. It allows us to be able to track, get a sense of how much equipment is going overseas and who's shipping it. And just like when the CRT rule was created and people needed to register if they were exporting CRT cullet overseas, providing some of that transparency helps to make sure and limit the amount of improper exporting that's going on. The enforcement regulations on this is just coming right from the existing export administration regulations. So if someone violates trade rules that are in the EAR, they have to face penalties, civil penalties that are similar to what people would do for illegally exporting any other types of commodities. And there can be criminal penalties as well. The way that the bill is written is that once it is signed into law, all of these changes would take effect 1 year after the law is enacted. And so that's the transition time that people need to be able to convert their systems to do this exporting. So where can you get involved? Well, again, we've got some bills that are being introduced. Co-sponsors are being announced. There's going to eventually be committees, hearings, and hopefully a floor vote. And there might be an opportunity to put this legislation on top of another bill too. There's a lot of different ways it can go. And the way that we're hoping people can take action is to write your congressperson. It still really works to be able to say that you live in that person's district. This type of legislation is valuable for all the reasons that Bob said. You can talk about how it would be implemented and how you can make that work and encourage them to co-sponsor the bill. There's a lot of information that's put together on the CAER website, and that CAER website is americanerecycling.org. And so you can go there to educate yourself, contact us through the contact us page to get some information about sample letters that you can send, and just really follow what's going on. And we'd love for you to really take action and get involved. So that's what I have right now, and we're going to be handing it over to Jim to talk more about the other part of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Now, I'm going to talk about what I'm calling the new and improved Basel Convention. The Basel Convention has been around quite some time. It's been around 32 years. The US, as Bob noted, is not a party to it. This is a glaring absence and a real problem. There's renewed hope that the Basel Convention ratification might be imminent. I'm not going to hold my breath, but I have to tell you, I'm increasingly optimistic at this point in history, and we'll talk about why. So the Basel Convention has been around. It was adopted in 1989. It entered into force in 1992. It's the world's only treaty on waste. It's been considered the world's real treaty on environmental justice at the global level, which is something the Biden administration is really behind at the domestic arena. But it's, again, missing the major global player. The United States, being the most wasteful country per capita in the world, is not part of the game. The treaty, however, has massive support, 188 parties, which is almost all the countries of the world. Now, BAN has been watchdogging the convention since 1997, and I myself, prior to that, at Greenpeace, was involved since 1989. So I've been to all the meetings and seen all of the developments. And the reason we call it a new and improved treaty right now is because there have been 2 amendments that went into force very recently, which make it indeed a new and improved and far more relevant treaty than ever before. So real quickly, what does Basel do? You can describe it in 2 ways, the soft law and the hard law. Soft law is general obligations. You're not going to have someone going to jail for not following a general obligation, but it's a glaring problem if that does occur. And that soft law calls for national self-sufficiency in waste management. Every country should take care of their own waste. It calls for minimizing all forms of transboundary movement of hazardous and other waste. It calls for minimizing the generation of hazardous and other waste, probably the most important general obligation. And for those wastes that are still produced that you could not minimize, it calls for ensuring that their environmentally sound management is assured. So the hard law, what it does is first, it defines what it's talking about, what's going to be controlled. And those are 2 categories. Hazardous waste and other wastes are in the scope of the convention. Hazardous wastes are in accordance with Annexes 1, 3, and 8, and they're also allowing any national government to declare something to be a hazardous waste nationally, and the rest of the world has to respect that. So that's another form of hazardous waste definition. And then there's other waste. These are Annex 2 wastes, which are defined as waste for special consideration. Irrespective and without prejudice as to whether they're hazardous or not, they've been identified as problematic and needing control. And those are waste collected from households, incinerator ashes from incinerating household wastes, and very newly defined certain plastic wastes have now been put on Annex 2. That's one of the amendments I'm talking about. So the other part of the hard law, of course, is how these defined wastes will be controlled. The default control mechanism of Basel is what's known as prior informed consent. It requires a notification to the receiving country before you export, and they have to consent to receiving it. That's the default control mechanism, and those procedures are set out in Article 6. Without that procedure, it's illegal traffic, and it's defined as a criminal act. So parties to the convention, like Canada, for example, need to prosecute their bad actors that violate the Basel Convention as a criminal act. And then there's another type of control, which is a prohibition, an out-and-out ban. And those take place in a few instances. The countries themselves can ban imports on a national basis. For example, China, as we know, following national sword, has banned all kinds of waste on a national basis. And they have the sovereign right to do that, no matter how much ISRI or another body goes to the US Trade Representative's office and complains, who then complains to the WTO. This treaty gives countries the sovereign right to control transboundary movements. Ban exists on the export to Antarctica. It's actually in the convention. No waste for any reason can go to Antarctica. And then there's a very important trade ban also between parties and non-parties. Unless you have a special Article 11 agreement, you're not allowed to trade between parties and non-parties. For example, Canada and the US has a special agreement. The OECD has a special agreement under Article 11, which is considered to be valid. And then finally, the new amendment, or not, it's not new, believe me. It was created back in 1995, but it's newly put into force as of 2019. So now this amendment is part of the treaty, and that is a full ban on the exports of all kinds of hazardous waste from developed to developing countries. So it went into force in 2019. So new and improved, we got these two new amendments that are responding to serious problems that play out on the global stage today. This first one I mentioned was the newly adopted listings on plastics, which are on Annex 2, waste for special consideration. And these can be roughly defined as mixed polymers. There's one exception, you can have a mixture of PP, PE, and PET. Contaminated plastics, so they have to be pretty pure. That's being debated as we speak, as what level of purity will be required. It's being debated on a national basis at the moment. They can't be halogenated, so PVC waste cannot be out of control. It has to be controlled, and then the exports have to be going for recycling. They can't go for incineration, waste to energy, or land disposal. So that's in a nutshell, and we've done other webinars getting more into depth on this new amendment, which you can grab from our website at BAN or at e-Stewards. And then the Basel Ban Amendment, again adopted in 1995, entered into force. And this has a direct bearing on electronic waste because most electronic wastes are considered to be hazardous waste. So e-Stewards standard, which is our certification program, already includes these two amendments. We go further in version 4 than the Basel Convention. These newly controlled plastics are considered under our standard as hazardous waste, and thus are barred from export, fully barred, not subject to prior informed consent, which is what the Basel Convention baseline is. And then, of course, the e-Steward standard has since the very beginning, and really was the reason why it was created, was to implement the ban amendment even before entry into force. So that basically says no exports of hazardous electronics. So these two waste streams, plastic and then e-waste, we're still seeing really harmful exports of both of these, and plastic has become more into the fore of attention of everyone on the planet right now. Since China erected the national sword policy 2 years ago and said we're not going to take the world's plastic waste anymore, we've seen a circus out there of waste trade. So much of the plastic is going to Southeast Asia, to countries like Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand, where massive amounts of it cannot be recycled and is dumped and is routinely burned. Some of it comes in as paper, in the paper pulp, some of it comes as direct exports of mixed plastics. But this is really what all the cities in the US and in Europe are producing, is mixed bales of plastic. They're not clean, they're not sorted, and they're highly contaminated. and they cannot be properly recycled. This is the point of the new amendment. Those things that are difficult or impossible to recycle must be controlled. Then we have a subset of the plastic, which is e-waste plastic. And this is a significant part of the issue too, is that most electronics recyclers don't have the equipment to sort the different polymers. And e-waste is made up of a myriad of polymers. And these are the very combinations which are not going to be allowed. And yet most recyclers are not in the business of separating this and certainly not processing it themselves. So this is a big bottleneck which is recognized not only for municipal plastic waste, but from the electronics recycling industry. And then of course, e-waste exports, which I've been following myself for 2 decades now. And we did our first film, Exporting Harm, way back in 2002. And so this has been a perennial problem. And it's the same thing that's happened with plastic waste is the US not being a party to the Basel Convention is in this strange situation where they can have their actors, their stakeholders, brokers, legally export, but as soon as that waste gets out on the high seas and is heading toward a Basel party, it's illegal. It becomes criminal trafficking in waste, and yet the perpetrator of it will never be prosecuted. This is why it's so important that the US become a party to the Basel Convention. And this trade is still going on. Why? How do we know? We use GPS trackers. Here's one of our staffers putting in a tracker into a flat screen, and you can see where they end up. This one was in Thailand. Thailand, since this revelation, has now banned the import of all electronic waste, but you can see quite a stunning operation here where the material was separated into circuit boards, and the circuit boards were burned in this smelter here. Very crude, no pollution controls, dioxin and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons spewing out over the farmland nearby. And this was a typical operation after China started cracking down. Then the Chinese businessmen went to countries like Thailand. Here's another facility that our trackers found. We followed them, got on an airplane, followed our GPS trackers to these facilities. In that hut there, you can find Burmese workers paid almost nothing, starvation wages. They live in the Gaylord box created shacks. They live right there on the property. They're illegal even in Thailand, but this is the kind of labor force. So you're not only talking about environmental problems, but human rights violations as well. And if you wonder if this is still going on, I just threw this slide in because 3 days ago, one of our member organizations in Indonesia sent me this new way of dealing with circuit boards. They are making stacks with roofing tiles and burning them inside, and they're just burning the circuit boards. And of course, the BFRs are making brominated dioxins, the BFRs in the circuit boards, etc., the lead emissions, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons pouring out into this community. So yes, it's still going on. And we have this problem. The non-parties of the convention. Again, the convention has amazing saturation. There are only 8 UN countries which are not parties. So it's a lot easier to draw a map of the countries that are not parties and to see how glaring it is that the US is missing from this game. We have South Sudan, Solomon Islands, San Marino, Haiti, Fiji, Grenada, East Timor, and the United States as the only countries in the world that have not ratified the Basel Convention. So the e-waste, which will be controlled by the Basel Convention, just to summarize them, anything with the circuit board, because even the ROS compliant boards have enough lead in them to consider them hazardous under the T-clip tests. CRT monitors, certainly with their lead and phosphor compounds. Flat screens that have mercury backlights, anything with mercury in it are clear examples of hazardous waste. Most countries now, though, consider, to avoid any of the testing that would be required, they just consider electronic scrap equipment to be hazardous. That includes a lot of the brominated flame retardants that are in the plastics. So then there's the waste for special consideration. Again, those are also part of the e-waste equation. Now, we have this weird situation, which I'm mentioning here too, is that with respect to OECD countries, because of a protest lodged by the United States at the OECD level, the exports of computer plastics and other plastics from the US are prohibited unless they're declared hazardous. So the OECD decided they're going to just follow Basel unless it's a hazardous plastic. So with respect to plastics and notwithstanding Canadian exception, be careful about exporting to folks in Spain, Portugal, Mexico, any other OECD country. You're going to have to declare those as hazardous at this moment. Kind of a strange thing that happened. Well, let's talk about what we could gain. What would happen if the US ratified the Basel Convention? And this is being brought to the fore anew, largely because of the movement against plastic waste trade and the sudden shock of realizing that almost every city and state is involved in illegal criminal trafficking in plastic waste. So that we have renewed momentum for this happening. Again, I'm not going to hold my breath, but it's getting exciting. The ban amendment is now part of the convention. It would prohibit e-waste containing those hazardous materials from being exported to non-OECD countries. And as Bob mentioned, this will make non-exporting recyclers much more competitive. The real leaders in the industry will be able to compete on a level playing field of ethics and responsibility. US recyclers, on the other hand, would be able to finally import hazardous waste from Basel parties. So this is always a big problem that comes over my phone and email from Caribbean countries, for example, that need to get rid of their e-waste, but they don't have any domestic infrastructure, and they would obviously want to send it to the United States. They're barred from doing that because of the party non-party ban, and they're not part of any Article 11 agreement that would allow them to do it. So this would finally open the doors to more business for electronics recyclers in the US from foreign countries. And again, the feedstock for counterfeit chips would be eliminated, so global security would be enhanced. And the exports of these Annex II waste, such as mixed and dirty plastics, would be allowed to other Basel parties because the US would be a party, including the OECD and the non-OECD with prior informed consent. So these exports to Indonesia could take place, but the Indonesian government would have to agree to them, for example. And there would be full transparency, and the US would have responsibility for enforcing those rules. And the US would finally join the global consensus that believes that a true and ethical circular economy is one that does not exploit externalities made possible by trade to weaker economies. The legality and fate of US exports would be far more certain. We would be able to prosecute exporters for, BAN has been involved in prosecuting a few, but it wasn't for environmental laws, it was for fraud. And the cases where you can bring fraud are limited. We've done it, of course, just to show how irresponsible and unethical the whole trade business is. But finally, the US would be able to prosecute exporters on Basel Convention criteria. US policies on environmental justice, again, climate change, rule of international law would be far more coherent. It's really an outlier and a renegade position that the US is in, being the only developed country not party to the convention. Many more recycling industries would be created and thus more jobs in the United States, as Bob has underlined for all of us today. So what has to happen for the US to ratify? Okay, the first thing that has to be done is we have to get new advice and consent. There was advice and consent for the Basel Convention originally back in the Papa Bush administration a long time ago. It was agreed, but most experts say that because the treaty is fundamentally changed now with the ban amendment being in there, it would need new advice and consent from the Senate. So that's in the Foreign Relations Committee. And then it will also need implementation legislation. This would be required, and this is more in the environmental committees, and they would likely have to have different definitions of hazardous waste for export to avoid upending the entire RCRA Act and how we define waste domestically with universal waste, hazardous waste, etc. So it's thought it would be a lot simpler, and this legislation has already been drafted in past administrations, a lot simpler just to have a different definition that complies with the Basel Convention for waste and hazardous waste. And there needs to be a big push from NGOs, from the public, and from recyclers, and any other business that wants to align with this cause. There's one caution that I have to raise here. The US State Department has publicly stated at a stakeholders meeting that I attended that they may try to find a way to ratify the Basel Convention without ratifying the Basel ban. And this was a pretty shocking statement coming from the State Department representative, because it's a legal impossibility. The convention allows no reservations or exceptions, and it says it right there in an article, and yet the US thinks they can do this. So it's a little scary because the US is a big fish and they can kind of do what they want to do. So it's very important that when we ask for ratification, that we ask for full ratification. Otherwise, on balance, this would not be a good thing for the US to be a party without respecting the international consensus on what should be banned. So what can we do to finally make this a reality? How can we take action? Well, we have started a step-by-step process to apply pressure to the Biden administration. The first step, many of you have taken part in this already if you belong to a business or organization. We took names on a sign-on letter. We're still gathering those names. So the front page of the BAN website, if you have not put your organization into this cause, please go and join. There's over 200 sign-ons now, I believe, and all the major environmental groups are on board, and many of them from around the world as well. So please sign on to that if you're an organization. But the next step is to have an individual sign-on letter. We hope to get environmental justice, leading advocates and celebrities, but any individual that wants to sign on to the letter to the Biden administration is going to be coming. So watch for that. We will put out a big announcement, and of course it'll be on our website. ISRI members, any of you that are members to the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, should push for ISRI to change their policy. ISRI is the only group we know that's really in opposition to SEERA, and to date they have been in opposition to the Basel Convention. So I'm not sure if they're going to hold to that position. I think they may be considering what they need to do. So pick up the phone, especially if you're a member of ISRI. And finally, write your senators. As Neil said, it really does matter. Get this on their radar. There's a lot of pressing issues out there that we compete against. I think some of the angles that are most powerful is that it's good for jobs, good for business. It's consistent with Biden administration's new efforts on environmental justice. It's consistent with our climate actions. So please read our letter language that was in the original sign-on and write your senators to push and apply pressure. Thank you very much. And I guess next we're going to be taking some questions from you all. And I believe I'll turn it over to Prema. She can tell you how you can ask your questions, and she'll be assisted by Angelo to do that. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jim. So we now have the forum open for questions. So you can either write them in the questions tab on the panel on the right-hand side of the webinar, or you can ask them verbally. Just put up your hand. We'll turn on your microphone so you can ask the question. You can also email it to us. The email IDs are available on your screen. So any questions?
Yes, as Prema said, if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll be sure to unmute you. Alternatively, as said, you can use the questions box or the chat.
And raising your hand means on the attendees list, there's a little hand icon. You just click on that near your name, and then we can see that you have a question. We gave them too much information. They're swimming.
We will wait for
Yeah.
a minute or two to see if any questions come in on the chat or in
Sure.
the questions tab.
Sure, and of course you can always call us or write to us individually. But
And in meantime,
these are two very important ways we can finally put a stop to this crazy export, and we really need your support.
And in meantime, this webinar will be available online on our e-Stewards website, as well as you will be receiving an email afterwards with a link to the webinar once we get that up.
The recording, yeah. Wow, I'm surprised. We had usually have a lot of questions. So pretty much, should we call it a wrap then?
Sure. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Jim. Angela, thank you for your support. We await your comments and questions on info@e-stewards.org, or you can also write to Paul as well.
Absolutely. Don't be shy to ask us individually how to move things forward. And in the meantime, take a look at our websites for the information there.
Sounds good. There is one question that just came in. It says, Miriam asks, usually during the period of implementation of new legislations that brings about a pretty significant change in a market, government funding gets allotted towards ensuring that we are using proper solutions. Is this something we'll see in the 1-year time period?
For SIRA, that's a question for Bob or Neil.
Yeah, this is Neil. I think I'll take that. The legislation's pretty simple. It doesn't make any provisions for any additional funding. And looking at what the additional costs would be, we're expecting it to be fairly minimal, especially since we're using established registration and export programs. So yeah, there wasn't any provision for that that's in the current legislation. That's a good question. Something to consider.
We do have one question here from Matt Frank. I will unmute you here, Matt, and give you the floor. You may now speak, Matt. Be sure to unmute yourself, Matt, and you can speak. If you are having issues, you can type it in the chat or send it as a question, and I'll be happy to read it out loud.
Doesn't appear to be there.
All right, seems like they're offline actually.
Okay. Well, I think that's wrapped in. Emma?
Yes. Okay. Thank you for your time, everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you for joining us today.